Hi guys, this is Mark. In this lecture, we will be talking about the user registration functionality in your UI Builder applications. Since UI Builder and the entire UI Builder runtime framework sits on top of Backendless, which provides the user registration functionality out of the box via very easy to use APIs, it's going to be very straightforward to implement the user registration functionality. If you're wondering what user registration is for, I think that's fairly straightforward. It's kind of the gateway into pretty much any application that requires a login. So you need to create the user account somehow, and typically the user registration screen takes care of that. There are several use cases you need to think about, whether they are important in your app or not, such as having two inputs for the password just to validate and make sure that the user enters the password correctly and doesn't introduce a typo in one of them to prevent that use case. But once the user registration succeeds, you will see that a record for that user is created in the backend, and I will walk you through it to show where you can find that information. And once that user record is there, that's essentially the information about the user. And then in your application, any further relationships like the orders that the user created or the blog posts that the user has posted or comments that they wrote, really depending on the nature of your application, everything kind of stems from that user object. So of course, after the user registration, there is login. You identify the user identity, you know the user roles, and so on. So many other complexities they come into play once the user identity is established. But creating that account is the very first thing that one should do. So now let's just jump into UI Builder and build a very simple user registration form just so you can see how to weave and integrate the backend into that UI functionality that a lot of us are very accustomed to. Now that we are in UI Builder, let's create a new page and call it user registration page. It doesn't really matter what the name of it is, completely up to you what you would like to call it. I always like to give it a name that truly represents the nature of this page. Anyway, click the create button now that we have this page, and to make it somewhat pretty, let's add the panel, select this panel and change the dimension so it is kind of a nice panel right in the middle of the screen. I will make the width 50% and the maximum height also 50%. And then select the block that contains this panel, and let's center this content by clicking the centering and the justify, and then centering and align items. And you can either completely get rid of this title bar or just select the text and change it to something like user registration form. This title could also either, well, let's just get rid of it. I think we already have the title in there, so this could go away. So we have this user registration form, and let's keep it simple. We will add a input that will be our email address. Change the label to email address, and let's also add a password that will be input. And in here, let's change the label to password. And also notice that in the type dropdown, you can select it as the password. This way, when the user starts entering their password, it's all going to be masked with star character. And we can also add the second password just for the verification purposes. Either drag and drop that, or you can just select this one and replicate it. You see this, click this button, so it replicates. And we can say re-enter password, like this. Finally, let's also add another one, which will be the user's name. So let's replicate email, and let's start with the name, and then it's going to be name, email, 2 passwords. And also let's add the button, which will be the button to actually handle registration. So select this button, and we can align it on this side. Get rid of the margins or make them smaller. Could be, for instance, 10 pixels on all sides. Here's our button. Let's see. I think that's good. Oh, let's change the label for the button to register. Just register. That's good enough. Is there anything else we need? I don't think so. I think that should be sufficient. So let's take care of the data binding, just so all the values, they go into page data in this case when the user enters all the values. So this will be name, and the value logic is going to be name. This will be email, and the value, the property name will be email. For this one, the property will be password1, and for this it will be password2. So at this point we have this form where all the values are data bound. They immediately end up in page data. When the register button is clicked, then we will go right into the user registration logic. Let's see what it looks like on the screen. It looks okay. Here I had the browser remembered my name and password from some other test, and it pre-populated because the IDs for these fields are the same as somewhere else. So you get this kind of side effect for this UI. Let's see what it looks like on tablet, and that's okay. And here we probably need to adjust the size of the panel to be a little bit taller, because the button kind of gets out of the panel. And for this we could say that the maximum height perhaps is 60%. That's all right. Okay, so let's switch to the on-click event for the button and start adding all the logic. Oh, by the way, one other thing that we might want to add is the status field, where we will display any errors or a success message. And for this, what I will do is I will add another block, put it right at the top. Here's this block, and in here I will add text to this block, and this text will be centered, and then this text will also be bound to status message. And then the block itself, we can change the dimension so the minimum height is not there. And also add a little bit of a button margin. There you go. One other thing is select this block and then turn off the display, because by default we don't want to display this block. And then for the block we can say that it is status message block. And then let's just see what this text is bound to. It is status message. Okay, now we have everything in place, and let's start adding the logic for the registration. Click the register button and then go to the logic. And in here you will see the on-click event. So this will be invoked every time when this button is clicked. The very first thing that we should do is to check if the passwords are the same. And for this we add logic. And then in the logic we get the comparison. We will extract password1 from page data. And we'll compare it to password2 from page data. Now I started doubting myself what the names were for the password fields, and I just want to go back and verify. So for password we had password1, and then for the re-enter password it is password2. Good. So now let's go back. So if these passwords are not the same right here, so you see this is not equals sign, then what we will do is we will need to toggle visibility of the status message block, and we will make it visible. However, before we do this, let's modify the value of the actual status message by setting the property in page data, and the property is status message. Remember that this is the property that the actual text is bound to, and then the text will say passwords do not match. So at the very minimum, now we can validate that this is working exactly as we would like to. Let's switch to the user interface and run this page. So in here, type in a value, and here type in some other value, and click register. See, now we get the message saying passwords do not match, which is pretty good. So at least the password verification logic is working. Let's close this. And in the next step of the evolution of our logic, we can add the actual user registration. And this will happen in the same codeless block. And here, if the passwords do not match, we have this logic. Let's add the else part. And else would mean that the passwords do match. Then in this case, we could actually register the user. The user registration functionality is available in a single block that is sitting in the backendless category, and the section will be users API. In here you'll see register user, and this register user you can just connect to the else part. In here it says that email must be defined, so there's some functionality in the block itself where it knows that some important parts are missing. So we need to connect email and password, but we also have name, and I will show you in a second how to get name. So the email and password are going to be available through data binding. Let's get this password because we already have it here connected to password. And email is going to be available in the email. So now it is there, but we also have the name. So to get name in there, click the gear icon and then drag the property and change it to name. Click the gear to hide it, and then replicate one of these and put name in here. These property names are the data binding properties, but these names, email, password, name, are also important because they must match the name of the columns in the users table. So now that we're talking about the users table, I think it's the perfect time to actually switch to backend and see exactly where this data will be going to, because it is important that the names that you use here, the name of these properties inside of the register user block, they are important and they must match the backend. So I'm going to click on the backend button. And in here, if you go to the data section, and I'm already in the data section, you'll see there is a table called users. And this table is always displayed in this system data section. I already have 16 users. And in here, so this is more or less modified the users table. When you create a brand new application, it will look a lot simpler. If you click on schema, this is sort of the structure of your table. And in your application, more than likely, you will not have half of these columns defined. But out of the box, I believe you get email, you get name, and you get password. So the important thing is take a look at this column called identity. And that by default, identity is email, which means that whenever your users log in, the identity is what will be used to identify them. Okay, identity, all the values must be unique. You can choose whatever identity you want to be for your application. Every app is different, you will decide. But in here, and in most of the cases, email is the identity that is in the application. So notice that in the registration form, we were providing data for email, name, and password. Notice that the name is one of the columns. And whenever you enter this data and then save it in the database, if you go to data browser for the users table, you will see all of that information in here. Of course, in my case, I also have location, I have age of the person, I have notification style, I have some other properties, phone number. They are really irrelevant in this particular demo, so they will just end up with no data, but it will still work. If you need to make some of the columns properties required, then you can change these constraints and then make sure that they are required. Like for instance, in this case, you see this, there is this BL user locale property. The constraint is NN, which stands not null, required, but there is a default value. So if we don't provide this property, then the default value takes place of that value in the database. In most of the cases, it will be fairly simple. If you need to make it more complex, you can add new columns by clicking the new button and declare the column. figure out the data type, and then you will be providing a value for this column in the registration form. So in here, once the user is registered, it will be here in this data table. You'll be able to see that user, and many other things will happen. But for now, let's just focus strictly on getting that information into the database. So I'm going back to front end and click the register button and go to the logic. And in here, we will be registering the user. So once this call succeeds, which means that there is no error, then the user registration is successful. In this case, what we can do is we can display the status message that says user registration is successful. And we change the visibility of this block to make it visible. Okay. Also, what we could do is we can empty out all the fields, email, password, name. But for now, let's just make sure that we can actually register the user, and then we will do some additional housekeeping and cleanup after that. With this, let's run the page, and let's add the user. That will be, for instance, Joe, and the email address is Joe Test. I'm not sure if Joe is already in there. So Joe Test and some password. I'm going to make sure that it's the same. Click register. There you go. It says user registration is successful. So if we return to backend and take a look in the users table, in here you see that now we have a record for Joe Test, name Joe, and of course the password. You cannot see the password because backendless uses hashing, one-way hashing, so there is no way you can actually see the user's password, but you can change their password if you need to. As the owner of the app, you can do that. So at this point, we know that the user registration is working, so we can do some other things such as cleaning out the fields. But what's also important is the process of handling user errors. Like, for instance, if the user is trying to register, but that email is already there. At this point, there is really nothing in our codeless logic that would handle that particular error. So let's add that, because that will be important. How do you know what error would be returned? Well, for this, we're going to go to backendless documentation. So this is the REST API. And if you go to user service API and click on user registration, this is all code-based stuff, but something that is very important is you see these error codes. So for instance, well, these are all the errors that may be returned from the user registration calls from that block that we're using right here. So this block could deliver an error, and then these are the errors that could occur. The most important one, or the one that I would like to add the logic, is this one. User with the same identity already exists, which means that we're trying to register a user, and that user is already in the database, and the code is going to be 3033. So let's add the logic to deal with that. If we go to the exceptions section and grab this try catch, we could put it right into the else statement, and in here all of this will go into the try. But inside of the catch block, we need to check if the error code is 3033. And for this, we can add this if and add the comparison argument and get the property of the code. Get the property, I believe it is code of the variable error. And in math, it's going to be 3033. And this print can go away. So in this case, let's modify the status message and say user already exists, and change the visibility. So now what we have is inside of the try block, we do the actual logic, and inside of the catch with error, we handle that error to see if it is user exists. And in this case, we notify the actual user who is registering with a status message. Let's run it one more time and see what we get. So the name, once again, is going to be Joe, and then the email, Joe Test at backendless.com. Password, same password, click register. And see, we get user already exists. So the codeless logic that we added for verifying that the user is there is working. Some additional things that you could do is, for instance, add the background color for this status message. And it could be red if it is an error, or green if it is successful. Let me show you how that would work. So, for instance, when passwords do not match, we want to set the background color of that block to be red. The block that needs to be modified is called status message block. So see what I will do for that. It's going to be set property in, go to component and get the style of, and select status message block, and the property is going to be background dash color, and then the value is going to be a string. You use pound ff000. So what is this ff000? Well, first of all the colors you use string for that, and they must start with a hash sign. And then you have the 6 characters or 6 hexadecimal digits to encode the actual color. There are plenty of resources online where you can specify or just select the color and it will tell you the code. A little in-depth view onto this. What you have is you have 3 different primary colors, and it's, if you heard the term RGB, it stands for red, green, blue. So the first 2 characters are the a byte value that represents the red component, therefore it's R. Then the next, actually I'm missing 0. The next 2, it's the green component, which is G, and then the last one, it's the blue component, B. So here I'm setting FF to be maximum red, and then G and B, the green and blue, are zeros. That means there's no any part of the green or blue. Therefore, this color is going to be pure red. Let me copy this, and since we're displaying that the user registration is successful, here we want it to be completely green. So 0 for red, and then FF for green. And in here, whenever user already exists, it's also going to be red. So let's set the color red. So now we have quite a bit of logic here that does a lot of stuff. In fact, notice that whenever we set the status message and we change the color, this could become a custom function where we just pass the text of the message and then the color that needs to be set, and then therefore overall logic will become a lot smaller because many parts of it will just be shifted to a function. Let's run it one more time just to see how well that works. So first of all, let's just do the password mismatch. There you go. You see we have this red color. One other thing that we could do is, as soon as you start type something into any of these fields, we could hide, change the visibility of this block, but let's not worry about it yet. So let's just register user Bob test at backendless.com, password, and there you go, user registration successful, and it is green. At this point, I think I have covered most of the use cases, most of the dominant use cases that you will have with user registration. As you can see, we have quite a bit of logic here, but there are definitely candidates here to make it more compact by moving some of the common functionality into a custom function. I hope you found this useful, guys. Thank you for watching this video, and as always, happy codeless coding.